listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
How do we get the most value from a piece of land? Welcome once again to the Ag Policy Connection podcast as we're continuing with this season exploring the future of land, including farmland across Canada and across North America, together with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute as part of their PLAN initiative. PLAN stands for Policies for Land Use, Agriculture, and Nature. On today's episode, we're focusing on the economics of land use change. How do we get the most value from an acre? How do we decide? In many ways, it comes down to how it's measured. Are we talking yield? We're talking raising crops or livestock on an acre or hectare of land. Are we talking dollars on an annual return, that type of thing? Some forms of value can, of course, be used to make mortgage payments that come every so often or are required every so often. But there are also other forms of value, as we've touched on in the last few episodes, including biodiversity, habitat for wildlife, hunting, fishing, carbon sequestration. Some of these forms of value are more difficult to monetize or put a dollar value on. So what drives those land use decisions? That's what we're going to explore with today's panel, and I'm excited to share this conversation with you. We have three solid guests, experts in this area joining us. And leading off the way, we have Sean Catherwood. Sean is a farmer in southern Saskatchewan. I have to say it's about time we have another farmer on the show, on the podcast here. He also works with other farmers through his business Spurline Crop Solutions, helping them unlock value in their land through different conservation payment programs, different offerings that are out there for different types of farming or different approaches, management, again, land use decisions when it comes to farmland. We also have Brian Innes. Brian is a familiar voice and face here at RealAgriculture as the Executive Director of Soy Canada over the last decade or maybe even longer. Brian's been at the forefront when it comes to some of the broader policy discussions and formation, whether we're talking clean fuel regulations, European export requirements, marketability, that type of thing. Brian's going to share some of his insight into that area, how policies at that level drive land use decisions in the broad sense. And rounding out our panel, excited to have some perspective from Quebec, as Pascal Theroux is a director at McGill University, senior faculty lecturer, economist, and so he's going to bring some great perspective as well, not only relevant for Quebec, but across the country when it comes to private versus public and policies that shape how land is used across our country. So without further ado, here's our discussion as part of CAPI's PLAN initiative here on the Ag Policy Connection podcast, focusing on the economics of land use change across Canada. All right, welcoming in our panelists here on this episode of the Ag Policy Connection as we focus on the economics of land use decisions made by landowners and farmers. We're pleased to welcome Brian Innes, Sean Catherwood, and Pascal Theroux. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's start with an around the horn to get some perspective on where each of you are coming from. Sean, why don't we start with you in Saskatchewan? You work with farmers on these types of decisions and in helping them navigate programs, incentives when it comes to land use and decisions around practices that they implement on their farm?
Yeah, that's right. So first and foremost, I do like to describe myself as a farmer as well. So I'm a fifth generation farmer south of Regina, Saskatchewan, 100% grain farm, but obviously looking at more of this regenerative type movement and how we can make some of these practice changes on our own farm as well. And outside of that, I have a lot of experience in the carbon market, you could say. Had a job with PepsiCo before this past year, where we created our own business here, where I was really heavily involved in the carbon insetting market with PepsiCo's supply shed in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba. So really opened my eyes to not just in Western Canada, but globally, this movement of investment, outside investment coming from food companies and whatnot, at different levels of the value chain, coming down right to the farm gate in the form of on-farm incentive programs. And then, so that's kind of tip of the iceberg. expanded from there. And now we do, like you say, we help other farmers kind of navigate through this movement of sustainability programs, on-farm programs. So not just, the private insetting programs of the world, but also the public government invested programs like the RALP or the SCAP or the OFCAF that exists in Canada right now. And yeah, so we really just help kind of hold their hand through the process of understanding what these programs mean, what they are, what they're trying to incentivize, why the government's spending money on this stuff, what kind of data is needed to capture on your farm to be able to enroll in some of these programs, and then also kind of the benefits and the opportunities that exist for these farms to help make changes as it pertains to land use that they're already interested in doing, and these programs can help with that financial piece to get them to where they maybe want to be.
So you know all the acronyms, Sean.
No, I don't. Some people in my organization do, but I don't.
Well, you're familiar with the important ones, it sounds like.
That's right.
Pascal,
Yeah.
what's your experience at McGill University? You have an or economics background. I believe you're an economist. Tell us about your perspective when it comes to work in this area of land use decisions, whether we're how we value our land and in different ways.
I've been being an agricultural economist by training, and I've been teaching in the farm management technology program for over 15 years, and I now head that program. And really, what I've been looking at, what my interests have been, has always been about the rural-urban divide, where society has expectations toward farmers, but ultimately those expectations are not always realistic, based on the fact that, well, the urban population does not always understand what farming involves. Therefore, I think their requests are legitimate, but disconnected from from the reality farmers have to deal with. And this is one of the topic I often do interventions on with the different media, because we need, I think, to reconcile those two divisions in order to help farmers make the right decisions for everyone.
And we'll definitely get into those decisions and how those decisions are made as part of this discussion. Brian, I know in the past you and I have chatted about some of this land use type criteria and definitions and those types of things, maybe more in the aggregate picture when it comes to national policy around, say, the clean fuel standard or other exports to the European market, where there's requirements regarding land use and that type of expertise that you bring to the discussion. Why don't you share a bit?
Yeah, well, great to be here, Calvin. So right now I'm serving as executive director of Soy Canada, and so really focused on export issues around soybeans. But over the last 15 years or so, I've worked on issues around land use, whether it's from canola into the EU to the United States. But our current focus is around deforestation and the European Union and the requirement for essentially every bean that goes into a vessel to be traced back to the field GPS coordinates and to assure that that land wasn't deforested after 2020. So we have a fantastic sustainability story in Canadian agriculture, and part of our role and my role here at Soy Canada is to look at where our export opportunities are and ensure we're able to meet those requirements and to push back also on those requirements to make them more realistic where there's opportunities to push back.
Sean, why don't we go back to you in terms of diving into the decision that a landowner or farmer goes through. What does it take to change how land is used, whether we're talking about preserving it for farming or wetlands, grasslands? Is there a dollar amount, or what is that thought process when you're working as a farmer or work with other farmers going through that thought process?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't know if this is a controversial opinion, but in my journey so far, there's no program exists at this time that's actually going to make a farmer 100% change what he's doing. That's not the driving factor. The driving factor has to hit where it hurts, so to speak. So farmers are changing practices because they're forced to, whether it be their business success. Maybe margin's been thin for 4 to 5 years. In some areas of Saskatchewan and Alberta, it's been dry for that long. They really need to start looking at how they operate their business, make changes that way. Or maybe it is climate related or environmental related. They see swings in their local geographical climate that has changed how they maybe done some practice management changes on their farm. So it's kind of things like that that are actually forcing farmers to make these changes. And I find time and time again, they're the ones innovating, and the programs are actually coming in a little bit later and are able to kind of still piggyback on that momentum that the farmers already started. And now that creates other issues like, okay, a lot of these additionality programs has to be a new practice, right, on a new acre. And that can be tough for a lot of these farms that have already innovated because they've been forced to for their own success with their own business. And now it's a struggle to find some of those additionality acres in those situations. And maybe we'll get into that later, but that's a bit of a rant and rave about how some of these programs are set up. However, there is still a demographic where, we kind of have those farmers that are sitting on the fence where they realize they maybe need to make some changes. Maybe it's for their own business or for their own well-being or for the health of their family, their local community. But they're maybe hesitant or scared to make that change. And it's those farmers that we like to help kind of be like, hey, well, if you do something, we do have this kind of funding available here, here, here. There's these different options. And let's take a look at the math, look at the numbers, and see if it's something that makes sense for you. So yeah, it depends kind of exactly which demographic you're talking about, but that's been my observation so far.
Pascal, Sean just referred to that issue with additionality and where farmers, if they're already doing something, our policies and programs tend to not incentivize that. You talked about how society has expectations of farmers to do certain things, but we run into this issue continually where society expects something or wants something, but there isn't a valuation or a monetization of that value, whether it's ecological goods and services, those types of things, or whether it's climate resilience. Do you have any thoughts as to how we can properly value some of these things that society wants, and so that farmers actually see some benefit from it going forward?
Well, just as a starting point, we've seen the same thing in Quebec as was just explained. The Quebec government put a 10-year, 2020, 2030 sustainable agricultural plan where they had multiple goals, but improve soil health, improve organic matter, optimize water management, reduce use of pesticides, improve biodiversity, and they are actually retributing farmers for good practices. But unfortunately, the farmers that already had good practices are not the ones that keep benefiting from it because they were already doing the right thing. And so if you look back from that, how do you properly value? Well, what I stumbled upon was a study that dates from maybe 10 years ago. And what they tried to do as a survey with the urban population, asking how much do you think is worth to not farm on wetland and different factors like that. And ultimately, the conclusion was that for someone from the urban area, the willingness to pay varied between $5,000 to $10,000 per hectare, based on the willingness to pay. But of course, there's always that bias where it's because a consumer is willing to pay that they will actually pay for it. I mean, I think we can go back to the same debate as we have with buying local on that one. But ultimately, that's what the conclusion came to for that specific study. But that's only from one side. I mean, it does not mean that on the other hand, the farmer would be willing to change their practices only based on money coming in, because there are reasons why that farmer is actually farming that land.
Yeah, I guess there are inherent benefits that the farmer is realizing. It just seems like there are some things that we as society aren't recognizing. And I think, Brian, that's something that when you're talking with the European deforestation program, in many ways, like you said, Canada already has a good story to tell. Canadian agriculture, again, speaking in the aggregate as a whole, has a good story to tell, but it's about actually realizing the full value of what's happening on farms across the country.
And ultimately, we have to remember that we're meeting the needs of a customer, and we're meeting the needs of the customer sometimes as defined by their governments, including our own here in Canada. You referenced, Calvin, earlier, the Clean Fuel Standard, for example. So the Clean Fuel Standard here, the American Renewable Fuel Standard, the European Biofuel Program, all have land use requirements built into them, as does now the European deforestation requirement. So it's a really interesting space because it doesn't matter how good our story is in the sense that these regulations and rules are set by customers. And in these cases, the customers are represented by the governments influenced by civil society in Europe. Just to tell an example of when we were having these discussions as Soy Canada with our farmers in Brussels as the regulation was getting finalized, we were reminded that ultimately you can come with facts and you can come with our story, but the pressure is being put upon them by activist groups, whether it's Greenpeace or civil society groups that speak for a segment of their society, literally had a banner on the main building of the European government that had Amazon rainforest burning. A big, massive banner on the side of the building. And so that those sorts of pressures put on governments, put on our customers, ultimately means that we have a choice to make in order to comply and continue to sell or to go elsewhere.
Yeah. Further along these lines, Sean, you talked about your experience working in the carbon market, and I know you go back a few years, and there was a lot of talk about farmers potentially having a significant revenue stream when it came to carbon sequestration, and that has yet to. There have been some examples where there has been some revenues that farmers have accrued, but I would say it hasn't happened at the scale that was talked about a few years ago. Do you see that still being a potential scenario at the farm level in terms, and is it government or is it private industry? Is it companies like PepsiCo that drive that type of policy at the farm level? Maybe insetting versus offsetting. That's a whole other part of that discussion as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, Kelvin. I think, again, maybe a bit of a biased opinion being from the inset world, but it's both my opinion of what I'd like it to be, but also I think this is where I also think it's going to go. I do believe the carbon inset market is going to explode here really soon in Canada. Already actually kind of is, more than people would realize. And it's almost like, okay, now put yourself in the shoe of the PepsiCos and the other food companies in the world. They have shareholders that they want to see invest into this kind of movement to supply that transparency of their supply shed. Where's the food, their ingredients coming from? Is it produced sustainably? Now, if you're a food company, you're not doing that right now. That's a competitive disadvantage, and their shareholders see that. So there's all this pressure coming from that level for these companies to really start investing into agriculture and into, Scope 3 emissions. So it's just getting going. You can see what's happening in the States right now. That's starting to happen in Canada. And there's a lot more momentum behind that movement right now than there is the carbon offset specifically in Canada. And I know there's some aggressive initiatives in Canada to try and develop that market to sell offsets off our land. And it's been a struggle to get to where we want to be, I think, basically because it's really messy. It's a really messy market because it truly is a market. And to actually quantify and monitor and measure the actual sequestration levels that are taking place on our land in an accurate way that these other industries can trust when they're investing billions of dollars to buy some of these offset credits, they need to be able to trust that data. And I just don't think they do in Canada right now. Mostly because a lot of the models we're using were developed in other parts of the world, like Europe, like Australia, like the States. And we're trying to develop kind of our own models right now. And we have some, but I think they're a little bit outdated in terms of how they practically align with the agronomy and what's actually going on in the field. So a lot of work needs to be done there in terms of the actual modeling, which I think is holding back on the offset market. And the inset market still needs models and it still needs to measure this reduction in carbon and sequestration carbon. But I find when it's, there's a little more effort put into it because it's streamed down from a specific company on their supply shed, plus this other specific company on their supply shed. It just seems to be working a little bit more efficiently right down to the farm gate. And I find farmers themselves are trusting these programs more because it's all about the story wrapped into this too of how what they're doing on their farm is streaming all the way through the value chain at the different levels, all the way to that grocery store when that product is sitting on the shelf and the consumer buys it. And there's a bit of a pride factor involved in that, of how the farmer was involved right from the start of that, on their land all the way to the grocery shelf, versus an offset. Sure, you can generate some revenue, but you sell off that credit and it's gone. There's not really any pride factor there, and farmers are very proud people. So that's a big, I think, cultural thing involved in this movement as well, and why I see the inset market having a lot more traction as we move forward.
That's a great point there, Sean. And do you think that means that more of the private, like you said, supply chain type insets or programs will be more effective than, say, a broad government policy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we also always have that clash of farmers and government, right? And government programs always existed, various different shapes and sizes. Some have been very successful, some not so successful. And I think we've got a nice assortment of programs right now that are being used quite successfully, and that's really good. And it's a piece of the story, but so is this private stuff. And I think the private programs, as we come along, I find they're a little bit more quick to adapt to what farmers actually want or need. They're willing to make those changes on an annual basis, whereas you get locked into an OFCAF cycle for 3 years, for example, and maybe this private inset program, you can change it on an annual basis because the feedback that they get from farmers. And the way a lot of these inset programs are getting set up is there is this whole peer network type situation getting involved where farmers sign on to this program, they get incentive money, but they also are part of this group, and they meet and they get together and they talk about things and they provide feedback back all the way back to this company, this big food company at the other end of the value chain. And there's just this communication going back and forth way better than we're seeing with the public programs. Again, that's just my opinion, and that's what I've seen so far.
Pascal, how do you see it when it comes to government versus private industry driven incentives for farmers to implement land use changes?
Well, when we look at government policies, the problem we have, I think, is that they tend to aim at the right target, but not get people on board as easily. I think what we have seen as successful initiatives so far were more in the living lab aspect, where the farmers were brought in with government agencies to work together to find innovative practices so they could actually witness it themselves and then be used as told you so it works. Of course, on the other hand, the private sector has, I think, probably better capacity to try to get a given momentum started. When you look at big corporations, especially right now, out of a food inflation cycle like we've seen, I'm always concerned about how the consumer trust would work if knowing an initiative would be backed by a large corporation. So I think going back to the farmer level, through Living Lab, through working with government agencies and the farmers together to try to develop those new practices and then publicize it too, to help consumers understand what sacrifice or what work has been done by the farmer, what results were achieved, and showcase the fact we're moving toward the right direction, because farming has lots of capacity and I think lots of future when it comes to carbon sequestration. And that's one thing we need to have the population realize, especially in a country like Canada, where we have lots of farmland, lots of possibilities, and farming is part of the solution.
Brian, from your perspective, you have worked for many years in government relations. What do you see? And you also represent organizations that have producers as members. What do you see as kind of a preferred direction or a path forward that would be effective in implementing some of these policies that society and government and customers, again, going back to customers, that they want, that also work for producers who are members of, say, the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers here in Manitoba?
Well, great question, Kelvin. I think what I would observe is that we have to recognize that there's a lot of different places where farmers come from. And so when we talk about one solution to serve all farmers, whether it's the 30,000 soy farmers across the country or a subset of those farmers in a particular region, there's a lot of diversity within that population. And so what we do in industry associations is help to create a dialogue that hopefully comes out with a consensus on strategically what is the best outcome. So I preface that by saying that way, Calvin, because in deforestation as one example, depending on where you are in the country, deforestation could be irrelevant or it could be quite important for where you are and the ability to bring more land into production. And so there's a lot of diversity when it comes to land use and farmers. And part of I think the challenge we have in industry associations with farm groups is that these issues become very emotional based on where people are. So whether it's drainage, whether it's deforestation, whether it's looking at natural solutions, for example, for segments of their land through other non-government organizations, as an example. So I preface that to say that having worked in this space for the last 15 years, finding a solution for farmers is very difficult. What we can provide are a menu of solutions. And I think what I would build upon is what Sean was saying is that the nature of industry and industry motivated efforts is they tend to align folks who have similar things to gain from a similar mission. And that's not looking to do it for everyone, it's looking to do it for the subset of folks who are interested in participating. So I say that in a sense, Calvin, to use the example of, in my past, I worked on creating a sustainability program for farmers to be able to sell canola to the EU and working with the export trade to be able to do that. It wasn't every farmer that wanted to sign up for that program. It wasn't every exporter either. But what we were able to do through the Canola Council at that time was work with the exporters, work with the farm groups to encourage those who were interested to get involved and to seize that market opportunity. So a bit of a tour de table there, Calvin, just to say that there isn't one solution, but a menu of solutions. And to build on what Sean was saying, helping provide commercial incentives for those who are interested really does bring folks on board and have a like-minded approach to solving what society or the customer wants.
Yeah. Would you say politically, and I don't know if this is a long-term trend yet, but at least in the short term, when you look at the US election results and where we're headed here in Canada in terms of politics, that we're seeing less interest in government driving this type of policy right now too than we have for the last decade?
Well, I would just say they're different. I would just say that the interest is a little different. I mean, Sean was referencing the offset. Well, part of the reason the offset thing doesn't work is because there aren't clear metrics, as he mentioned, and sometimes just as government stepped in for the Weights and Measures Act more than 100 years ago so that we're all using common weights and measures, so too does sometimes there need to be a public role for defining how to measure things. So I think what I'm reflecting there is that it may look different in terms of how governments play a role, certainly, but they still may play a role.
Hmm. One thing that is coming through here, or that I'm reading between the lines, and I'm wearing my farmer hat here a little bit, is that farmers, we don't like to have options taken off of the table. We don't like to be told we can't do something. And I guess, Pascal, as an economist, trade-offs are something that that economists like to talk about. And that is one of the trade-offs here is farmers have to make that, if we're going to implement, as a landowner, implement land use change, there are certain things that we have to take off the table. And that is part of how that decision to go back to the decision that we talked about with Sean at the beginning, that has to be factored into that decision, those trade-offs.
Yes, indeed. And if we take a historical stand on that one, we have to pretty much go back to time where the farmers were exploiting the land, farming the land, and you had a whole bunch of experts surrounding them, more educated, that would guide them toward the right solution. And nowadays, we're more in a situation where all those farmers are in a partnerships with the scientists and their agrologists, and they work hand in hand together to achieve a given solution, but the farmer remains the expert on their own land. And that's why I think when you look at the trade-off, you have to try to convince someone who's an expert on their own land that what you're trying to bring to them is the right solution. So money could be a driver, but it's not necessarily the only driver that you'll be able to push through to make them take that decision.
Yeah, and that ties in with what Sean said before about we're proud of the things that we produce, and sometimes it might be something more of a psychological valuation that we attach to that. We're working with a company and knowing that that's our product or something that we helped contribute to on the store shelf kind of thing. There might be value in that for a farmer rather than monetary value, right?
Well, I think all farmers rightfully believe they're doing the right thing and that they're doing it properly. So if you try to confront them by trying to implement change, you're telling them they're doing something wrong, which will hurt their belief, and that's absolutely normal. So how you approach it, I think, will make a big difference, both monetary and I think psychologically.
Hmm. Sean, as we look to the future, and you've touched on this a bit already, but what do you see as areas where you're excited about value being unlocked for farmers to potentially make progress on some of these conservation and ecological type practices?
Yeah.
Is it on the carbon market? Is it on other areas? There's so many different metrics in which we measure sustainability. That's part of the challenge here.
Yeah. Well, I think to Brian's point, what's exciting is the options that will be available to different farmers that are doing different things. Like back to what I was saying about the pride thing, about being connected to that, to that metric ton of canola that you produced on your farm that got crushed into an oil that got used to fry a potato chip, and just the whole story through that, and being able to prove, how you've produced that metric ton more sustainably than your neighbor or someone else in a different country, whatever it may be, and having so that carbon incentive model there. But then maybe not everyone's interested in being involved in something like that. Maybe they don't want to, transfer that data on and be paid for that. Maybe they're a little bit more reserved and they just want to do a better job of what they're doing on their land for their own purposes. They don't need a program to necessarily push them there. But there's going to be options for, the education and the awareness around that and the storytelling around that. And I think as we move forward with these programs that are at surface level designed to offer monetary help to farms, I think a secondary benefit that we're going to get from this is the storytelling. And at the end of the day, like I mentioned at the start of this chat, I think most consumers around the world would be surprised at how innovative farmers actually are in terms of sustainability. I think we're doing a better job than they think we are at times. And again, it's about telling the story appropriately at the right time to the right people. And I think these programs can actually offer a vessel to do that in a weird way. And now there's some handcuffs we got to get through, like the additionality stuff. And sometimes these pioneer farmers or innovative early adopter farmers are left out of these programs because of eligibility requirements. And we need to start looking at that a little bit more as an industry as a whole, whether that's the carbon markets or public programs, and trying to include those early adopters to kind of like bolster them up. Like they led the way, they blazed the trail. They brought a lot of farmers with them, even before these programs necessarily existed. And how can we not only thank them for that, but also actually kind of provide some sort of benefit to them, whether it's them telling their story, which benefits their business and their brand, if they're direct marketing or whatever it may be, and how we can kind of work at this together as a group. Even though we are in little different silos and people are going to have different goals. But again, it comes down to the options that are going to be available there to share your story, to collect some monetary help, to access diversified markets for what you're growing or producing on your farm, depending on your different practices and whatnot. I think it's going to be overwhelming. All the options farmers are going to have at their disposal, but that's a good thing. And like you say, farmers like options. So again, as our business that we have, we hope to kind of help some of our clients through that stage that might be overwhelming, but I think also very exciting.
To me, it seems like one of the big challenges here is we have people who are leaders in these things, and in some cases, people might know they're doing the right thing. They might be providing a public good, but it's tough to pay your seed bill or your equipment bill with those warm fuzzy feelings.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
and I don't have the answers for that, but hopefully as an industry, we can figure that out together.
And maybe that's where, from what you're talking about, maybe we are seeing more industry-driven type programs that recognize the value of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
If I could jump in there, Kelvin, I think sometimes there's always an expectation that we're going to get paid more. But the reality is that sometimes if you don't do it, you're going to get paid less. I mean, if I look at the EU deforestation issue as an example, certainly now we understand farmers have pocketed upwards of $50 million in premiums to be able to be part of supply chains to serve that European market. But it's equally true that if we don't sell to Europe, then we're selling to markets that pay less. And so I think we have to be realistic in terms of where the markets are. If I listen to the farmer chair of the United States Soybean Export Council, they see sustainability as a real advantage. They look at their competition being Brazil and deforesting millions of acres, and they look at the United States and they see about 5,000 acres perhaps not complying with the EU requirement. So strategically, we sometimes need to recognize that there's not always a premium, but it's actually in our best interest to look at how we can meet sustainability or land use requirements.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you, shifting gears a bit, part of the value that we've seen on some of these programs, sorry, I'm going to cut this out because I did have a different thought I was going to go with based on what you were saying, Brian. IP soybeans would be an example where we are already seeing some of this coordination between players in the supply chain, right, Brian? And I guess that might be a model that we see more of in other parts of agriculture.
Yeah, in our identity preserved food grade soybean infrastructure, we've got about 1.4 million tons of production, where the seed companies, the farmers, and the exporters all collaborate to provide over 100 varieties, 100 specific varieties to customers. And in so doing, what we found really interesting about this EU deforestation piece is that those companies already have all the information essentially and the systems required to be able to meet the EU tofu and soy milk or other soy food requirements in the EU. So it's true that there is a tension to say that the bulk handling system is very efficient. It's very liquid for farmers. They can deliver whenever they want and make and manage risk according to the futures markets, etc. But we've also seen on the food grade soy side, for example, farmers are paid essentially 30% more per acre to grow a specialty product. And we've seen it in specialty oil, canola also. So it's all to say that farmers do have options, and being able to work with value chain partners oriented around what the customer wants can provide value back to the farm level.
Pascal, we touched on this a little bit earlier. The issue of farm financial health and profitability when it comes to implementing some of these changes. What do we see when it comes to farmers? I know as many young farmers, we feel like cash flow, we're farming to survive to be another year. And Sean, I won't speak for you, but I know in my case, that's how it often feels on the farm side of things here. Like we can't have a bad year or we can't take a huge risk because we don't want to miss our land payments for the next year kind of thing. What do we see in terms of farmer behavior as it relates to their financial health? And of course, we're in a time now where margins are tighter than they have been for a while, and that affects some of these decisions too. How does farm financial health relate to the implementation of some of these or adopting new practices in land use?
Well, any change you will make on your farmland as a farmer in a country like Canada, where our growing season is somewhat limited, will always be influenced by the farm's financial health, the farm's capacity to take on financial risk. And I think that's why in the past, all our public policies were based on the carrot and not the stick, saying, I will give you more money to get into something to offset some of the risk that you are taking without making the farmer realize that at some point it is possible that the stick will come and that your product will not be relevant to the consumers. So for young farmers, I can see the extra stress you have because you're not sitting on a lower debt load. You're not sitting on proven practice that have always worked. But at the same time, what I've seen is that the younger farmers are the ones that were the least rigid toward change, and that probably understood best what was in line for the future. And that could be because the level of education with younger farmers keeps increasing year after year. Every ag census that comes out, we see that young farmers have more and more agricultural training, more and more scientific training. And I think it goes beyond, I'm doing it like that because it works, and more toward the science of agriculture that helps understand the risk and maybe mitigate the risk on its own because they can better see the benefit of it.
Yeah. How do you see that, Sean? I know, for example, I have a neighbor here in southern Manitoba, a young farmer who has made a commitment on his farm to always have, I think it's 10% of his acres or something like that in alfalfa, in a forage crop. That's an investment that doesn't help him with cash flow this year. It'll help with soil health and resilience, all those types of things in the longer term. It's like a 7-year return though on that commitment to putting alfalfa in. How do you see that as a young farmer as well when it comes to making these types of decisions where you don't have a whole lot of room to gamble, but at the same time, as Pascal talked about, young farmers also tend to be more willing to try new things.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I think about all the time. I know myself so I've been farming for 5 or 6 years now. When I finished school, you come home, you're all excited to get farming with your dad, and then you start you go through the motions and you realize everything we've been doing it the same way for a while. You start questioning things a little bit more. And I think to Pascal's point, this generation is more educated into the science of agronomy and animal science and plant science and soil science, whatever you want to call it or name it. And these students or these younger farmers are coming in asking more questions than I think we ever have of why we do things certain ways. And I myself was definitely in that boat. I'm still in that boat. So I kind of consider myself, I don't know what you want to call it, but a bit of a needle mover, I guess. I've made a lot of changes on our farm that definitely not everyone loved. Kind of transitioning from more of a conventional model to this regenerative model, growing cover crops, and everyone thinks I'm growing weeds and like, what the heck am I doing? All this kind of stuff. And for me, it was almost comforting or a sigh of relief to remove myself from what I call a drug addiction to our conventional ag in terms of like relying on these equations and these chemical solutions for everything over and over again, kind of expecting a different result when at the end of the day, of course, we're all reliant on the moisture and the conditions that we get from Mother Nature. So we're in this weird spot where it's risky to not invest in our crop because what if it does rain and we get an awesome crop and we have a very profitable year and we need that to survive for maybe the next 2 rough years that might come down the road, which we see a lot of right now. It's kind of boom or bust, it seems like. But yeah, it's kind of weird when you think about it that way because we're also leveraging ourselves quite a bit by investing hundreds of dollars an acre into inputs, hoping it does rain. So it seems like a bit of a disconnect of what we're trying to do at times. So I know personally, this just comes from my own experience, my own farm. I've actually found comfort in removing myself from that and working a little bit more with the land and with nature. And I actually feel like it's less risky. And there's other ways to approach how we manage our agronomy when we actually can react to different environmental conditions and we're not throwing everything in the kitchen sink at it right away. Like in terms of fertility, going through the drill, 100% of it. Ourselves, we've kind of gone more the spoon feeding approach as it relates to fertility and trying not to go down a rabbit hole here, but just different ways to mitigate risk and kind of just watch and observe what Mother Nature is going to hand to you in that year and utilizing some of these soil health principles within our cropping system to build resiliency, really, which is the whole plan. And it's kind of that switch is stressful at the start, but once you kind of make that switch, I found personally it's made my farming operation more palatable. And sure, I'm maybe not chasing super high yields like some of my neighbors, but it seems like I also don't have that super drag effect either. And just finding that level where I like to stick at in terms of production and also having the capability to start looking at diversifying that revenue with these programs, but also with market diversification like Brian was talking about. There's situations where like IP soybeans, for example, is just one specific example, but we can grow higher value crops and maybe not chase that super high yield all the time. And we can take a look at how that affects our bottom line in our books at the end of the day. But every farm's different, everyone's context is different, and that's just my own experience so far. But yeah, it's been a journey that I've enjoyed, I guess, and I'm glad that I've made that decision to start looking at things a little bit differently because margins are razor thin, like they are for everyone, and you start playing the game of buying more and more land to spread that thin margin over more acres so you can actually make a living, and that's getting tougher to do. Farmland values are going higher and higher. It's harder for younger farmers to buy land, and yeah, just the domino effect of all of that, and different ways to look at how to approach how you manage your farm. But that's just a bit of my own experience.
I'm taking notes here. A future episode with Sean and his dad talking about the conversations that they went through. It'd be fascinating, I think. You made a good point about margins and farmland. Pascal, when it comes to recognizing some of these public good values or the public good that farmers provide or landowners provide, do you see there being an interplay with land values in the future if farmers are getting paid for some other aspect of farming other than the crop that they're taking off of it?
Well, local jurisdictions will have a big impact. I did not get into the details. I know this morning the Quebec government just proposed a new bill that would actually limit the increase in price land based on speculation and the capacity for people to use farmland as a speculative tool. So, of course, if that's going on, it's because there are people that are buying farmland at a price that does not make any agronomic sense right now. At the same time, indeed, margins are razor thin. So the only way you're going to increase your bottom line is by trying to farm more farmland, by implementing better practices. And I personally have seen former students going organic, not necessarily because they believed in organic, just because it made no sense to buy farmland in the area where they were at. The low debt load on the farm allowed them to live with the risk of having organic yields with conventional prices for 3 years. And in their case, it was a good move to make. But it's not everyone that is able to do it or that is willing to do it for the same reason. Sometimes you have generational clash where the young farmers come back on the farm, that has been plowing forever, and you try to implement no-till, and first thing you know, yields go down. And then you have to try to make it hold long enough to make the point that ultimately no-till will pay, because on the bottom line, it will be profitable. But if you just look at short-term numbers, it's pretty hard to actually look at no-till and have it make sense on year one or on year two.
Yeah, those are great examples. I think those are certainly aspects that we have to consider in this, and risk. Maybe further to what Sean was saying before, just because we're doing something new doesn't mean it's necessarily more risky. It might be a matter of how we look at it, how the perspective on it. Final question here, as we are running short on time quickly, and this is a topic we could talk about for a long time, but what do we see coming in this area when it comes to policy? We have hinted at some of this already, but when it comes to future land use policy driving incentives in the market or coming from government, Brian, you've talked about some of what we're seeing from the EU. There's a lot of uncertainty right now when it comes to biofuel and renewable fuel policy in the future, and what kind of signals there will be to landowners there when it comes to land use. What do you see on the horizon, or things that you're looking at when it comes to the future of policy in this area?
Yeah, great question, Kelvin. So I'll build on the policy piece and also add the market element. So on the policy piece, I think wherever we're going to have biofuel policies, we're going to have requirements around land use. It's part of the quid pro quo, so to speak, of societies, and has been for many, many years. On the market side, one thing we haven't touched upon is the demand from the market and how that is coming into shape what farmers do in terms of land use. So we've talked about the carbon piece and regenerative agriculture, but I would add into that, even just when we look at our customers in Japan and the EU, the sustainability requirements under the how that's defined is also making its way into purchasing requirements. So right now we have a program that involves all of our major food grade exporters that have signed up farmers for verified sustainable supply, completely driven on that market demand of consumer and packaged good companies and food manufacturers managing that risk and wanting to have a verified sustainable supply chain. So I see more of that happening. The likes of, as has been mentioned on this, PepsiCo and Danone and Nestle and Unilever and others. There's certainly an element of trying to de-risk their supply chains. And that can be something that's an advantage for us in Canada, as many of our farmers easily comply with these programs. So I see it that these things are here to stay, and they're an option for farmers in some cases, and in some cases, if you don't take the option, then you limit the options that farmers have.
Mm-hmm. Sean, how about you when it comes to things on the horizon that you're excited about or that you're exploring and considering implementing on your farm or with your clients?
Yeah, that's to get specific. I know one thing I focused a lot about on my farm is the cover crop conversation and how to incorporate cover crops into a rotation and actually kind of treat it as a profitable cash crop and not an actual cover crop that you use in place of a cash crop, and kind of take that break from collecting revenue from builds into these programs too, because there's a lot of programming for cover cropping right now. It's the buzzword. It's what everyone wants to see when you're a food company coming in Western Canada with all this money to flash around at farmers. First thing they want to see is that cover crop growing on that field. So we're trying to stay on top of that, I guess, with our business, and that's where I know we didn't talk about it a whole bunch, but some of the disadvantages or maybe trade-offs of some of these programs are they can push practices that farmers just go and do for the sake of collecting a check from the government or whatnot, and maybe don't actually have a strategic plan around what exactly is that doing for you on your farm? Why are you growing that cover crop, for example? What is the goal with that? How are you going to do it? What are the management tools in between start to finish to make sure that it's a success for your operation and a profitable situation for your operation? And instead, some people just do it, throw a cover crop out there and grow it. It's a complete mess. They collect their check. They never do it again. So did that really incentivize anything positive? Not even a little bit. So again, it's education and the transfer of knowledge around some of these practices, which is something we try to do with our clients too. Kind of full meal deal of, okay, this program exists, and if you're interested in doing some of these things, here's how it could maybe be applicable on your farm. Let's actually build a strategic agronomic plan around how this could benefit you, so that, yeah, you do it, you collect your money, it helps with that practice change, but you really, at the end of the day, I think these programs want to see this too. It obviously is, that's actually successful for that operation to the point where they want to continue to do it year after year after year going into the future, and they don't need that monetary bump up anymore from that program because they've seen it with their own eyes and on their own books of how it's benefited their farm. So I'm really excited about that, I guess. I'm passionate about tying that all in together and making sure that these practice changes really do benefit everyone long term, and they're not just a quick short fix to collect some money. So that's something that, yeah, I just am really excited to work on and work towards in this industry for the rest of my career.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. Pascal, what are your thoughts on the direction that this area of policy when it comes to land use, and whether it's market or government driven, where this is headed from a landowner perspective?
Well, I really like what Sean just discussed, because usually government evaluates the success of public policies by was the money spent or not, without trying to achieve a long-term goal of actually getting it done. And therefore, you look at public policies and yes, the money was spent, therefore it was a success, but did the farmer do it for the right reason? Would the farmer keep doing it? Or did they understand why they were doing it? That's one thing that we always have to keep in mind. I think probably there's some work to be done there. And from the consumer end, we tend to have the consumer in a homogeneous block, but that's not how it works. I mean, we're all as consumers really noble in our hearts, but just look at the EU deforestation rule, for example, and the forecast for coffee prices going up. And I know that's not the big production we have in Canada, but as soon as consumers will start getting hit with 20, 25, 30% increases in their morning coffee prices, all of a sudden, all those policies that we were asking for as consumers, as citizens, we might be the first ones to actually ask them to slow down a bit on it. So, and that's the thing with science. It always lies in the gray zone. It's never all white or all black. And moving forward, I think that like, as they say, the best way to eat an elephant is with small bites. And that's the way we'll have to do it. And that's how we're going to have to take it and reconcile consumer expectations and the way farmers farm their own land.
Mm-hmm. One thing we haven't touched on here is our ability to measure and verify a lot of these things. And that's something that maybe where government in the past has spent money on incentivizing certain practices that, as Sean alluded to, aren't always better for overall efficiency. But maybe on the verification and measuring side of things, would that be a place where government has more of a role, Pascal, just as a final point here?
Well, I think the government's role would be to actually set the metrics that we're trying to evaluate. We're trying to improve or value the ecological protection or what we will be doing to better our farm use or farmland use. But what are we trying to achieve as a goal ultimately? I mean, you could just say, well, stop farming, let nature take over. And from a biological perspective, maybe that's the best solution. It is not from a farming standpoint. So what are you trying to achieve? And where do you set that bar between our traditional farming and the best potential ecosystem protection practices you might be able to implement?
Cool. Well, the questions keep coming here, but I think we should probably wrap it up, and hopefully our everybody joining us as well, listening to the podcast and watching on YouTube has, I'm sure they have lots of questions as well. So thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your perspective, and we'll certainly continue the conversation, and I look forward to connecting with all of you again on this sometime. Thank you for taking the time to join us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kelvin.
Thanks.
Once again, this is only our third episode in this season of the Ag Policy Connection, focusing on the future of land across Canada. But once again, we end the podcast at a place where we could continue the discussion for a long time, as lots to think about when it comes to the future of land and again, these policies, the economics behind land use decisions, why changes in how land gets used happen, what's causing those changes across the country. Thanks again to Brian Innes, Sean Catherwood, and Pascal Thireault for joining us, sharing their time with us, and of course, more importantly, their insight, their expertise. And so thank you, gentlemen, again. And looking forward to continuing the conversation. Next episode of the Ag Policy Connection, we're going to dive specifically into housing versus farmland, how to balance the two interests, especially in those areas around urban centers, whether we're talking Southern Ontario, Southern British Columbia, or every town, village, city across the country. You have the issue of urban expansion, the loss of valuable prime farmland, all the tension that comes with that, with protecting agricultural land. Is it important? How important is it? Again, how do we measure it? We're going to dive specifically into housing versus farmland on our next episode of the Ag Policy Connection. In the meantime, if you have any comments, questions, thoughts, or perspective from your experience, my email address is khepner@realagriculture.com. On behalf of the Real Ag team, including our producer for the Ag Policy Connection podcast, Jason Strovey, and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, I'm Kelvin Hepner. Thanks for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection podcast. And until next time, take care.